Welcome to Future Fit Leadership, a podcast for emerging, experienced and executive leaders to build community, grow capability and future-focus their career pathways. There has been a global shift in how we lead people. Traditional models are being challenged and our workplaces are dynamically adapting. We know the static paradigm of the industrial era simply doesn't work for today's knowledge economy. But we don't yet know what the new paradigm is exactly. So let's find out. In this podcast, you will hear and connect with leaders, CEOs and visionaries who are challenging the status quo and sharing their future-ready strategies. No matter where you are on your leadership journey, this podcast will give you practical ideas and actionable tools to break open our assumptions of how work works. Future Fit Leadership is your place for bite-sized learning for executives hungry to make a change.
Future Fit Leadership acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Hello and welcome to Future Fit Leadership. My name is Sadhna Smiles and I'm your host. I hope wherever you are listening to this podcast, you are well. Right now, 735 million people face hunger, and 1 in 3 of the world's population is malnourished. But the global food crisis is the elephant in the room, too often ignored in political discussions and in the media. It's a climate crisis, a conflict crisis, and a cost of living crisis. It demands a massive and joined-up global response that is currently lacking. Powerful voices and organisations are coming together to demand our leaders recognise this crisis and take the action needed. In a bid to meet the UN's second Sustainable Development Goal, SDG 2, of zero hunger by 2030, one campaign is asking you to eat more beans. Its argument: beans are cheap, long-lasting, nutritious, versatile and planet-friendly. Chickpeas and lentils is what will come to mind for many when we talk about beans, and they are the most commonly consumed. Beans can be found in every corner of the planet and actually are relatively easy to grow. The humble bean can help us in 3 ways: our wallets, our health and nature. But consumption of the bean is declining as it is often seen as the poor man's food. Yet 1 in 10 people went to bed hungry in 2021, and nearly half of the world's population cannot afford healthy diets. Here in Australia, 1/3 of Australians are already reducing the amount of meat they eat due to affordability. They are replacing them with pulses, which are amongst the most cost-effective source of high-value nutrients. Pulses also help reduce the environmental impact of food systems by emitting far less carbon than many other crops and livestock. So beans can play a role in reducing hunger and malnutrition. They are a source of income for farmers. It produces less emissions, so it's better for the planet. They grow just about everywhere and they need very little water. So to talk more about why beans are important for our future, I reached out to Paul Newnham, who is the Executive Director of SDG 2 Advocacy Hub, which campaigns to achieve the UN's goal of ending hunger by 2030. Today, he joins me to talk about why beans can be the solution we are looking for. Hello, Paul. Welcome to Future Fit Leadership Podcast. Great to have you and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, no, it's so great to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Now, as we do with all of our guests, maybe give us a small insight into who Paul is before we get into our actual broader conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Australian, born in Australia, but then spent my early years growing up in Asia and then Africa. And so I had parents who were traveling, and so spent a lot of time in South and East Africa, and then also in Bangladesh and India. And then as in my early career, I kind of started out working particularly with young people in youth leadership roles, and then moved from that into a role at World Vision, World Vision Australia, where I worked for about 8 years, and then moved into executive leadership in New Zealand, and then with the international office. And so worked around the world as a result of that. And ended up working for the United Nations based out of Rome for the World Food Programme. And then that kind of morphed into, and we developed the what I'm doing today that was incubated there. So my background's been growing up across the world, very diverse background, very broad kind of set of countries and places. And so that's kind of helped shape the person that I am today.
I really want to unpack that a little bit because I find that really intriguing. You've grown up in Africa and Asia in places like Bangladesh, and people haven't been to these countries. Google it and you'll realize what we're talking about. How old were you when you were there?
So I went first to Bangladesh. My parents went to Bangladesh when I was 7. And so I was quite young. So I was in primary school. I went to Bangladesh when I was 7. I actually ended up in boarding school in southern India when I was just before I turned 8 for 3 years. So I went to
No
a
way.
boarding school in South India, which was
What was
tough, to
that
be honest.
like?
I mean, look, it was quite traumatic for a
Yeah.
kid. My dad had been to boarding school himself when he was younger, and so it was kind of understood and deemed it was an appropriate kind of course of action. But it was tough on my parents and it was tough on me. You grow up fast, and I think you learn to adapt. And in my leadership journey, I've looked back and gone, it really built an independence, but it also had some negatives. It had positives around building that independence, that ability to kind of carry yourself and to be able to advocate for yourself. I think some of the challenges is that it also had impacts around your emotional development. And we all know that as leaders, we need to be able to empathize and be able to connect with those that we're working with. And I think that's meant that I've had to work through some of that stuff as years went on and my kind of leadership journey continued. So it was an interesting start to life. Definitely not what you would plot out and choose, but I'm a big believer in your story is your story, and you have to kind of own it and use it, I guess, in the best way possible to really develop and lead you into the places you want to go.
You would have been 7, 8, 9, and probably the only non-Indian in the entire boarding school. Were you in an international school?
I was in an international school. So there was probably about, at the school at the time, there's probably just under half were Indian. Then there was a whole variety of other nationalities. So there was one other Australian there in this school, and it wasn't a big school, but it was all different cultures. So you were exposed to people from all around the world. So very, very diverse. But, then you got to catch the train home, all the way up the coast of India to Bangladesh, and, lots of different experiences, just seeing very, very different walks of life, different starting points for people. And so it really opened your eyes at a young age to the world, I guess, and to culture and diversity and all the different things that go in between that.
And what about Africa? How old were you when you went to Africa?
So Africa was after, in between that, we came back to Australia for a number of years. I did the beginning of high school, the end of primary school and the beginning of high school. And then we went to Africa when I was about 15, and it was a very different experience. I went as a day student to an international school that did have borders there, but it was a very different experience. And so that also opened your eyes. Being like an expat in that community meant that there were certain privileges and openings that kind of you quickly understood and saw. That was good and bad. You have teenage years in that kind of environment can be a bit challenging, but I got to see a lot of different approaches, different people from different nationalities, and kind of built this very interesting network right from a young age there.
You are truly a global citizen, aren't you?
Absolutely.
You have friends from all over the world, I imagine. Do you speak any of the languages where you lived?
No, I wish I did. I mean, that was one of the downsides of going to an international school, is that it was very similar. Everyone spoke English and they were trying to test their English on you. And so you would always have, and also obviously India and Bangladesh were British Empire, as well. So English is spoken fairly broadly. And then I was in Malawi and Zimbabwe, which were also the same. So you've got kind of a very kind of built English into curriculum, and it's one of the national languages. And so that ability to learn another language, unfortunately, wasn't as easy as maybe I look back now and wish I did learn something else.
This would have been strange coming back to Australia. Did you go through any sort of culture shock? I mean, you know, and when you look at the way we live versus the two countries that you spent a significant part of your life in, was there a culture shock that you went through when you came back?
Yeah, there was. I mean, my parents and grandparents were telling me about a story of when we came back from Bangladesh, where my grandparents had a vacuum cleaner, and this vacuum cleaner, I was like fascinated. We had not had a vacuum cleaner in Bangladesh. And so and I was picking it up. I didn't realize it had wheels. So I would pick it up and move it and then vacuum, and then pick it up and move it and vacuum, and things like that. You know, escalators. We were fascinated by escalators. We just hadn't seen them in Bangladesh. And so it's a very flat country. There wasn't a lot of big multi-story buildings at the time where we were. And so escalators we just apparently were fascinated by as kids, and you'd go up and down, drive our parents crazy. But there was just lots of little things like that I guess are simple things that you can kind of remember. But there was a lot of culture shock around just the way things worked, I guess. The way the playground kind of rolled out, the way what people were into, the types of music, and very different when you're in different parts of the world growing up.
I hope you're writing a book about this at some point, Paul, because
it's being
fascinating
discussed.
stories.
It's being discussed.
I look forward to it. Let's now shift to what you're doing today. And today you are the executive director of SDG. So for those people who don't know what that is, what it stands for, give us a bit of a background on that.
Yeah. In 2015, there was the United Nations came together with all of the world leaders, and they initiated a thing called the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals are a set of goals. There's actually 17 goals, and these goals are built around a sort of sustainability agenda. And I particularly work on SDG 2. They're a set of goals, but then within them, they have these goals, and each goal has a number of different targets that are measured, and countries report on those targets. But this is essentially the global footprint or the global plan for sustainable development. Each of the goals has a tagline. So there's like no poverty, zero hunger, health and well-being for all, water. And so they go through all these different issues. The goal 2 is around zero hunger. And really within that, it's a bit more than just hunger. It also looks at nutrition, biodiversity, agriculture, and climate adaptation. So there's a number of elements built into this. And so I was asked in 2017 to set this up, incubated in the UN, in the World Food Programme, to work with private sector leaders, civil society, and United Nations organizations to help kind of create a network of networks. And so the idea is that we convene, catalyze, and connect issues around sustainable development 2, goal 2, with a focus on food, agriculture, nutrition, and climate adaptation. And so within those sectors, we're basically helping to try and get people to work together. And so it works with leaders and some of the top organizations in the civil society space. So you're working with groups like Oxfam, Save the Children, World Vision, all of the big INGOs, but then also a number of the philanthropies and the foundations. You're then working with private sector. So we work with a number of multinational companies and councils as well, like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the Consumer Goods Forum. There's a range of forums as well.
A whole heap of collaboration by the sound of it.
Huge amount. And so we're working across those groups, and then also the UN agencies. So there's like the World Food Programme, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, these different entities. And our job is to try and help say, how do we kind of work together to get that progress? And so it's working and filling gaps. It's identifying spaces and narratives that we can utilize to help kind of elevate those messages.
And I think, Paul, it'd be good to break down some of the numbers of the millions of people who are facing hunger today, and some of the research articles you sent me. And by the way, for our listeners, if you want to connect with Paul, he's on Instagram, and we'll put his handle on our show notes, and there's a whole pile of information there. But one of the research pieces that I read that you sent me, it says, there's 735 million people who are facing hunger. And I think when you start to hear such big numbers, it's really difficult to comprehend, isn't it? And that article actually went on to say that it's become the global food crisis has become the elephant in the room. How do we, and I know we want to dig into how we stop that, but how did it become the elephant in the room? Was it because it was just a growing problem that nobody knew how to solve?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's really interesting. So over the years, there has been, what we've got to remember is population continues to grow globally. So you kind of have the number of people in the world keeps going up, but the number of hungry people as a percentage has been going down for a number of years. But then it turned, and it's kind of a little bit like a tick that's upticked. We've had things like conflict, COVID, the cost of living crisis have all had these kind of massive impacts on these numbers. And so what you're seeing is in certain parts of the world, you're seeing hunger numbers really, we're winning the battle in some ways. And you're seeing that COVID shifted that somewhat, and you saw that uptick. So there's about 122 million more people in 2019 before COVID, so we're kind of got this shift that's happened. It is really big numbers. And I think part of the challenge why it's become the elephant in the room is that trying to address food system issues is really complicated, because there's no simple, it's tied up in economics, it's tied up in our desire for cheap food, it's tied up in trade, supply chains, and lack of biodiversity. Like, there's so many elements. And so when you start to think about that, it's really hard for us to address it. So this year, even though those numbers are really high, the UN's appeals for assistance are only really low. They're only a quarter funded at the moment. And yet we have 21 countries that are nearing catastrophic levels of both debt distress, which then impacts their ability for them to be able to deal with these issues, and food insecurity. And so there's all of this kind of evidence that this is really a crisis time, a quarter funded, massive numbers, and yet it's not really being discussed in our media or in our political forums at the level that it should. So to me, that's really the elephant in the room. It's like, we've got this massive crisis here. And I mean, if you look at the numbers, you go from 700 plus million hungry, you go to 3 billion not getting enough nutrition in their diet. And that's like, so in a world of 8 billion, 3 billion people not getting the right nutrients. So it's also these long-term issues. And I think, when I think about this from a leadership perspective, it's about kind of almost kicking the can down the road, because a lot of those nutrition issues are going to come up downstream. And so we like to deal with kind of what's happened as a result of these issues, but we don't like dealing with the preventative measures that actually can help us stop seeing these issues.
Paul, tell me, how do we measure global hunger? Because when I look at those numbers, it blows my mind. But I'm interested to know, how do we actually measure global hunger around the world?
So there's the Food and Agriculture Organization, alongside 5 other UN agencies. They do an annual report called it's called the SOFI report in a familiar way, but it stands for the state of food insecurity in the world. And the numbers are always a year or so back, because you can't obviously talk about what's happening right now. And so the measurements are done on a number of fronts. And so there's a number of elements of reporting that are done on a certain level of hunger. And so it's people over that threshold. And so you have reporting happening across the world that way. There's also now been brought in a perception element to it. So it's like a study which is done, which actually measures the perception of people's ability to feed themselves or to have access to food. So it gives kind of an indicator of how people are feeling as well, which is a kind of more directional number, because always these numbers, I mean, it relies on governments as well to give you the data, and not every government has the same system or the best system. So then you have to also look at previous years. Like, there is some countries which will give you data very irregularly for political reasons as well,
of course,
because they don't really want to be perceived as having hunger issues or other issues. They're being seen as developed kind of economies and that side of things. So there's a number of factors which come into that. But if you want to find out more about the technical element of it, the State of Food Security report is the place to go. And then Maximo Torero, who's the chief economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization, kind of is probably the person to go to for this. And he's done a number of videos and podcasts to explain that as well.
So in the bid to meet the UN's goal of zero hunger by 2030, you're part of the campaign asking us to eat more beans, which I love and I find fascinating. And before we go into the campaign, zero hunger is a massive goal. And it's great. Like, that's a BHAG if you ever asked for one, right? So how does the UN intend to reach that, given, we've got an affordability crisis, we've just come out of COVID, we've got a war in Ukraine, food prices have gone up, wages aren't keeping up. There's a whole heap of issues happening just in the first world, leave alone what happens in the second and third world. So how does the UN intend to reach that?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a range of interventions when you look at a big goal like that. It's never just one thing. It's a range of kind of ways that you need to think about how do we kind of drive forward change. And so, as we kind of look at that, we break that down. And so the goal itself has, the first part is kind of getting the hunger number down. The next part is the nutrition element of it, because that's the other part. It's not just feeding people food and then not giving them the right nutrition. The next part is how the food's grown. And so it's the livelihoods of smallholder farmers. Many smallholder farmers don't get that kind of level. They often can't even afford the food that they're growing for various reasons. And so you've got to look at it in a kind of systemic way. And I'm saying that not to not answer your question, but to say it can't, there's no simple answer there.
Yeah.
And there's no one thing. And in these kind of goals, you've got to kind of go, well, how do you look at it in an integrated way with lots of different elements? So in 2021, there was a UN Food Systems Summit, which was the first time that the Secretary General called that. And it was designed to kind of help people understand food as part of a system. And within that, to actually understand then the hunger element within that as part of a food system response as well, and looking at all of the elements that you need to do. So some of the things that were accelerated out of there is school feeding programs, for example. There was a coalition built around school feeding, which is looking at rolling out universal school feeding into different countries. And there's countries that have adopted that in the past couple of years in a really big way, and it's growing. Now, school feeding, some people will argue, is a little bit late because you need the first 1,000 days, the first 5 years. But it's also part of the solution. It's not the only solution. We need to look at all of these. But something like school feeding helps create a safety net. And so I think when you look at this, you've got to look at safety nets. And so in Australia, we have safety nets, which the government, come out of our taxes for the people on the lowest income to be able to get access to a certain level. And I think there's a part of meeting this goal is to get safety nets universal. Then there's also looking at, when you go above that, what do you do to make kind of affordable, nutritionally diverse foods? And so how do you think about that? And that comes down to the way governments do subsidies. It comes down to the way farmers are paid properly for what they have. There's so many elements that go into that. And so that's about making food accessible and affordable as well. So I'm just giving you a snapshot of the kind of way that this is thought about. It's not just do this and we'll all be right.
I wish it was. I wish it was that simple, Paul. Just do this and we will get this sorted out. Now, why beans? I mean, I'm an Indian. I have we grew up on dal and lentils of, many different shapes and sizes. In fact, if you have a look in my pantry, there's about 8 different jars of, beans that all look different, and we eat them a lot. But why beans?
So we were in a meeting as part of the UN Food Systems Summit, and I chaired the Public Engagement Task Force. And as part of that, we were kind of bringing senior leaders together, and we had this interesting group of leaders from different walks of life. And in the conversation, there was lots of scientific answers and people trying to say, we should all do this. We should all do this. And Chef Sam Kass, who was the Obama's chef in the White House and then the head of food policy for the US in the second term of the Obamas, he was on, and he came in and he said, sometimes when we think about driving change, it's really complicated. And we get confused because we're trying to lead people into this space and there's just too many things to do. And he said, what if we could pick something that most people would agree is a good idea? So we're not going to spend so much time debating, should we do it, should we not do it? He said, what if we could do that and then build some kind of confidence that we actually can change the system? And so he said, what if we could double the consumption of beans in a year? And he threw that out there and people went, interesting idea. Some of the scientists said, why beans? Why not this? Why not? They started debating. Some of the companies that were there, they were like, we love it. It's simple. It makes sense. We can communicate this. This is it. And so there was a conversation started. And then as that kind of continued, we picked the idea up with Sam and we've developed that into a campaign. We looked at the science and the science says you need 5 years at least. So we've made it 5 years, not 1 year. Little things like this. And the part of the reason for looking at beans is because beans are nutritious. So they're nutrient dense, they're rich in protein, dietary fiber, really good for gut health. They have no cholesterol, low in fat, rich in micronutrients. They have iron, potassium, B vitamins like folate, so much going on there nutritionally. They're also good for the planet. So they are part of improving soil and water quality. If you bring them into your agricultural practice, they reduce the need for certain synthetic fertilizers because they take atmospheric nitrogen, make it into a plant usable form. They use less water than many crops. And so they help us conserve water. And they're also culturally relevant. They're versatile and they're delicious and also affordable. So you can get them in dry form, in jars, in cans, all different types. And most cuisines, as you said, India, massive, cultural background in utilizing them, but you'll find the same in Latin America, in North America, yes, in Europe, and so there's very few solutions that you kind of come up with that have got that diversity, that give you that nutritional profile, that also have an environmental profile, and that are also relevant. And most cultures aren't being told you should eat. Like quinoa was used as a classic example, but it's a South American grain that then everyone in the world's eating. Whereas this is like something where we're all eating these things, but they're seen as poor, cheap foods. They're not given the level. Like they're seen as this thing you eat when you can't afford something else, or you don't want to, it's a can on a piece of toast. It's not necessarily celebrated for the benefits that it has.
What I find interesting, and this is a conversation I had with another guest of mine a little while ago now, was the environmental impact. So we were talking about cows and the impact that, cattle have on our environment and atmosphere. And, one of the questions we talked about was, well, how do we change farmers to do something differently? And here is a solution, isn't there? Because the research that I did, which was off your Instagram page again, it says that the beans can grow in really harsh conditions. They don't need a lot of love, attention, water. In fact, they can grow in quite degraded soil and land. And so much of Australia is actually that. So are we then looking at or missing out on opportunity, but for farmers or from a government perspective? Because wouldn't this also be just a whole new export sector?
So when you talk about beans, you're talking about the legumes family. It's a broad family. There's peas, lentils in there. There's also lupins. And Australia is the #1 exporter of lupins at the moment. And so we do a lot of that. We're using most of it for animal feed, the export. And so there's a challenge there. A colleague of mine is doing a study at the moment. They just got a grant to do a study to look at the nutritional qualities of Australian grown crops. Because at the moment we use US data. But her early findings have been that there's huge, like Australian crops are actually more nutrient dense on the whole. So they could be sold as a premium on their protein levels and other things. So there's all kinds of different opportunities, I think, from a government and a business perspective here to really think about how we're actually really investing and really diving in. Because Australia doesn't get as much subsidies of crops, farmers do, like a lot of cover cropping is done with beans and peas and lentils. And what happens is in Australia, we kind of commercialize them or we sell them. In other parts of the world, they often get dug in. They don't necessarily get commercialized because there's subsidies for other things and the models don't work. But I think there's a huge opportunity in Australia to really be market leaders in really providing this, particularly in some of those degraded soils, and using that to also create value in carbon credits, in more nutrient dense foods, and looking at that affordability, because Australia's got scale.
So when you talk about climate change and zero hunger goals, they're tied in together. What are some of the ways that we can address both of them?
I mean, I think there's a huge amount here. So climate change is our environment. And so when you think about it, there's all kinds of things going on at the moment. We're losing nutritional density in some of our crops because of climate change, because of, exploiting soils, not investing in soils, planting the same thing over and over again, so that you kind of lack biodiversity and ecosystem. And so then you have to supplement that with lots of additives, and that becomes more and more challenging. So I think if we, simple choices in our diet, so we can be eating more plants and looking at where we use animal proteins. I'm not anti-animal proteins by any stretch, but I just think we eat too much on the whole, and that we should be looking at and making more wise choices around the scale and size, and thinking more about how we have a more diverse plate. And I think, what we put on that plate is really key. And so beans, peas, and lentils are great. I'd also say things like seaweed are really important. That's, captures carbon into the ocean. Millets, for example, and I'm sure in India it's the International Year of Millets at the moment. Millets use a fifth of the water than rice to produce, and they're more nutrient dense. And millets, from amaranth to foxtail, there's all kinds of different millets that traditionally were amazing foods that help cover hungry periods, but they're seen as peasant food or poor food. But they're also seen as superfoods when you go into health stores in New York. So there's this weird kind of dynamic that's gone on. And so I think at what we choose to eat and how we eat is so critical for actually making an impact on the climate.
I was just thinking that when you were talking about it, the perception that we have. I mean, some of the foods that you've just mentioned there, if I go into my, very fancy supermarket, I'll be paying a fortune for some of these things. And, yet I grew up as a kid, eating them as staple, everyday, healthy food. So how do we change the perception of beans and get people to eat more beans as such?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a big challenge because they have got these kind of connotations which are built in. And I think, we have to look at how do you change perceptions in all kinds of other areas. And so there's lots of classic examples in the food space, like spinach and Popeye. How, all of us kind of know that, even people outside of kind of that age group, they know about this kind of Popeye and spinach. There's also been great examples around, you've got kind of a crayfish and stuff that were used, or lobster. Lobster used to be fed to people in prisons, and the prisoners would revolt and say, we don't want any more lobster. And so then they changed the perception by serving it on the high-end first-class trains as a kind of delicacy. And now it's one of the most expensive foods. And so you can change perceptions. So I think what you've got to do is you've got to look at it in a couple of different ways. You've got to bring together stakeholders, champions, and influencers. And so how do you make beans more visible, affordable, accessible, desirable? So this is like social media content. It's having beans turn up in restaurants that set trends. It's going to involve TikTok and all these kinds of different channels to kind of get out there. What are the benefits of eating them? I think you also have to bring in nutritionists and people that can give you that health advice, because people are kind of interested in the knowledge around it. I know if I whisper about a food when I'm in New York, I'll say, you should eat this. And literally someone will walk across the room to say, can you just tell me what you were saying that I should eat? Because people are desperate to improve their diets. They really want to understand that. I also think then we need to look at how do we work with decision makers? What are the environments? And so you talked about agriculture and growing in Australia. We need the right data, the right research to go in, so that farmers will grow things that help the soil, that help their farms, but that have got to be profitable. And we've got to find that balance. And so I think it's about, how do we think about policy agendas? How do we get people to eat more beans, to grow more beans in different ways? And so that can be school meal programs, it can be dietary guidelines, which are being reviewed at the moment in Australia. How do you think in the dietary guidelines, how can we get people to actually ask real questions about what's being advised as what we should be eating in our diet. And that sets policy, which then goes into prisons, into military feeding all these different elements. And so I think this is really, really key. And I think, I've seen companies and leaders in many companies think about diversity. And I think diversity needs to be in also the food they're providing and what they're also selling. If you're in F&B, how are you putting more diverse grains on your menus? How are you thinking about different nutrient densities or climate impacts? And so all of that's happening. We had a catering company just recently join us on the Beans is How menu challenge, and they rolled out across 1,000 sites new beans-based dishes, and their staff got really excited. It went into all these canteens, amazing kind of experience. But those kinds of decisions really matter.
And I can tell you, beans are yummy. You can cook them in 1,000 different ways, and they are very yummy. Now, you're in partnership with the Chef's Manifesto. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so the Chef's Manifesto is a network of chefs now in over 90 countries, of chefs that come from all different walks of life that are connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. And so back in 2018, we were looking at how do we engage chefs in a conversation around sustainability. And I met with a number of different chefs around the world, and they were interested in like zero waste, in biodiversity, in different elements, nutritious food, different components. But what we were missing was a framework, a universal narrative or language. And so we created this narrative and framework with them, co-created in a unique way. And that's become then this network now of chefs that show up, they advocate in their own restaurants, they speak on global stages, they do dinners at global events. So we've done cook for prime ministers and presidents right through to more public, festivals and street festivals, but educating people around what can they do in their kitchen, what can they do at home, and how can they make choices which make a difference. And so it's a power of narrative that's created an action plan to drive and release people to actually engage and be a part of a community.
And there's 8 points in the plan. Do you want to share a couple of those with us?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a number of different elements in the plan that all kind of tie in different ways. But there's things like the protection of biodiversity and improved animal welfare. And so, like, if you think about that, it's about how do we get more biodiversity? There's 30,000 plants in the world that are edible, yet the majority of our diets only include about 150. And then we get 60% of all calories from about 4 or 5. So, like, our diets are really narrow. Yet we need to think about the world's pantry. We need to think about, and chefs can be a way into that. If a chef puts something in front of you, you tend to eat it.
You do.
Because of the way it's presented, the flavor, the smell. So it's really important. We also talk about livelihoods. How do we invest in livelihoods of the farmers, and who advocates for that? How do you think about the staff in the restaurant? How do you, in different parts of the world, it's very different how restaurant staff, and during COVID, it was a massive issue, because most of our hospitality staff lost their jobs. They very quickly were out of work. And then also the farmers had huge losses so there's all these kinds of interesting dynamics, which we talk about. So we go across that. We look at nutritious food that's accessible and affordable, a whole range of different issues.
And the campaign, I mean, how long has the campaign been going for now?
So the Chef's Manifesto we launched and created 5 years ago. So it's an amazing group and continued to grow. And so we have groups that meet most months of the year around the world in different places. And we have chefs. I'm going end of this week to Tanzania, and we've got a range of chefs coming at the African Food Systems Summit, and we're going to have a culinary village, and we're building chefs talking about different issues. But it just kind of creates a different conversation of chefs using the ingredients to create something.
And so what does the next sort of 12 months or 2 years look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, we're our advocacy hub. So we were incubated in the UN, and we've pulled ourselves out. We're working now across a range of campaigns. So from a leadership perspective, it's working out where do we go and how do we kind of move from this kind of agile startup that was incubated in a big UN bureaucracy into how do we best help accelerate change. And so how do you drive that innovation? How do you manage that whilst also building the kind of structures in? And so it's a leadership challenge that you see across the world. So we're working on that. We've got a number of exciting, so we've just about to launch our Beans as How theory of change, which is really a framework that's been worked on with 15 scientists to develop how are we going to go about doing that. Our Chef's Manifesto work continues to grow, as well as a number of other narratives. We've got a campaign around the global food crisis as well that we're working on. And so it's continuing some of that work. There's a lot of excitement. We're working with a range of players on, 1.5 degree aligned menus and all kinds of other interesting things in the mix at the moment.
So your call is for us to eat more beans. As individuals or business leaders listening to this podcast, what's your call out to them? How can we help you achieve your SDG 2 goal for zero hunger by 2030?
Yeah, so I think you need to look at where you're at in your business and what are the opportunities. Obviously, if you're leading people are going to thrive when they have a nutritious diet that is giving them the right kind of starting point for gut health, for good nutrition, and bringing in pulses is a key way to do that. And so think about what you can do to kind of encourage that. I also think from, look at your supply chain, look at what you do and see how can you think creatively about more diversity in your supply chain. So thinking about new products, there's a lot of energy going into kind of the alt protein or plant protein market at the moment. Most of that's beans, peas, and lentils in some sort of way. And so there's all these kinds of elements, I think, as leaders that you can be thinking about. But I think really not sort of seeing food as just this thing that happens alongside the way you work, but use the table, use staff functions to educate people, to bring them into that story. And I think there's lots of creative ways to do that.
And if people want to connect with you, Paul, what's the best way for them to do that?
Go on LinkedIn, Twitter, or X
Instagram,
now, isn't it?
Yes,
Instagram
yeah.
or Reels. So if you just go to Paul Newnham, you'll find me there and just reach out.
Paul, thank you for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation and all the best with what you're all trying to achieve. It's a big goal and I do wish you all the best with that. And I'll certainly be encouraging my group to eat more beans, that's for sure. Well, more than we already do, I have to say.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on and really appreciate the conversation. Yeah, looking forward to seeing some bean recipes.
Yeah. If you like what you've heard, please share, rate, and review this podcast. And don't forget to share this with anyone who might benefit from hearing it. The producer of Future Fit Leadership is Maritza Barone from Guide Your Light Network. If you would like to reach out to me, please DM me on any of the social media platforms. I'm available for speaking at conferences or consulting in your business. Future Fit is created in partnership with Future Leadership, a capability ecosystem for boards and executives. If you'd like to join the community and receive a free takeaway each week, sign up to the Future Exchange app in my show notes. Thank you for having me in your space.
This is a Guide Your Light Network production, creating podcasts with purpose.